I've always believed that life pivots on single moments. For me, that moment came on a rain-soaked Tuesday in October, when I was already running late for the Bakersfield annual Pigeon Exhibition Committee meeting. At 45, I had my life arranged just so: respected judge in the pigeon competition circuit, comfortable condo in the better part of town, and enough distance from my divorce to call myself contentedly single. The subway platform was crowded with the usual afternoon rush: business people clutching coffee cups, students with oversized backpacks, tourists bewildered by the local transit map. But as I stood there checking my watch for the third time, something pulled at my awareness. A magnetic sensation, a gaze. I looked up and saw her across the tracks. Red hair like wildfire, untamed in the humid air, green eyes that somehow reached across the distance between us and straight into parts of me I'd forgotten existed. She couldn't have been more than her late 20s, but there was nothing childish in that stare. It was knowing, confident, as if she recognized me from somewhere I couldn't recall. I looked away first, embarrassed by the heat spreading across my cheeks. Claudia Cooper didn't blush like a schoolgirl. I judged national pigeon competitions, for heaven's sake. I made tough calls without flinching when million-dollar breeding stock was on the line, yet here I was, flustered by a stranger's glance. When my train finally arrived, I boarded quickly, gripping the overhead rail and trying to forget those green eyes. But the universe had other plans. The train lurched to an emergency stop just as it was leaving the station. Bodies collided, apologies murmured, and suddenly she was there, pressed against me, her hand accidentally gripping my waist for balance. "I'm so sorry," she said, but didn't move away immediately. This close, I could smell ginger and something earthier. Bird feed, maybe? A familiar scent in my line of work. "No harm done," I managed, my voice surprisingly steady despite the riot happening in my chest. "You're Claudia Cooper, aren't you?" Her smile was knowing. "The Pigeon Judge. I've seen your articles in Breeding Monthly." Before I could respond properly, the train jerked back into motion, and she steadied herself against the door. "I'm Georgia Lee. I breed Birmingham rollers." Of course she did. The universe wouldn't just send me an attractive young woman. It had to be one from my professional sphere, one who would be submitting birds to competitions I might judge. One who was absolutely off limits for precisely that reason. "Nice to meet you," I said with professional courtesy, already rebuilding the walls her gaze had somehow breached. "Always good to meet enthusiasts." "I'm a bit more than an enthusiast," she replied, and there was that confident look again. The train slowed for the next station, and she leaned closer than necessary. "Hope to see you around, Judge Cooper." As she slipped past me to exit, I felt her hand brush against my coat pocket. By the time I reached inside and found the business card she'd planted there, she was already disappearing up the station steps. "Georgia Lee, Evolutionary Pigeon Genetics," the card read in elegant lettering. And below, handwritten in blue ink, "Some connections are too interesting to ignore." I should have thrown the card away right there. Instead, I tucked it carefully into my wallet, telling myself it was merely professional courtesy. But the warmth lingering where her body had pressed against mine suggested something far more complicated was taking flight. That business card burned a hole in my wallet for 3 days before I finally admitted to myself I was going to call her. But fate intervened before I could make that decision. The competition registry for the Western Regionals landed on my desk, and there it was, Georgia Lee, 5 entries in the Birmingham roller category. "Damn it," I muttered, tossing the registry aside. Now I couldn't contact her even professionally without raising eyebrows. The pigeon competition world was small, and gossip traveled faster than our birds. Martha, my longtime colleague and the only person I'd consider a friend in the circuit, poked her head into my office. "What's got you cursing at paperwork?" I hesitated, then pushed the registry toward her. "One of the breeders. Met her on the subway last week." Martha scanned the document, then gave me a look that said she understood exactly what I wasn't saying. "The redhead? I've heard about her work. Controversial genetic methods, but impressive results." She leaned against my desk. "And apparently impressive in other ways too, based on your face." "It's nothing," I said too quickly. Just unexpected. Claudia Cooper. I've known you 20 years. Nothing doesn't make your cheeks match your lipstick. The pre-competition reception that evening was held in the hotel's garden terrace. I wore my standard judge's uniform, conservative black pantsuit, subtle makeup, hair pulled back in a tight bun. Professional, unapproachable. Exactly how I needed to be. I was discussing judging criteria with a colleague when I felt it again. That peculiar awareness that had struck me on the subway platform. I didn't need to turn around to know she was there, but I did anyway. Georgia Lee in evening attire was something to behold. Her wild red hair was partially tamed into loose waves, and she wore a deep green dress that made her eyes look like emeralds. She was surrounded by older breeders, all men, all clearly charmed by whatever she was saying. When she caught me looking, she smiled and excused herself from their circle. "Judge Cooper," she said, approaching with 2 champagne flutes. "I was hoping to run into you." "Ms. Lee," I responded formally, accepting the glass but not drinking. "I didn't realize you'd be attending tonight." "First-timers usually don't," she admitted, "but I made a persuasive case to the committee. Something about bringing fresh perspectives." A breeze picked up, sending goosebumps across my skin. Georgia nodded toward the glass doors leading to a small balcony. "Bit quieter out there, if you'd like to discuss Birmingham rollers without the crowd." Every professional instinct told me to decline. Instead, I found myself following her into the cool night air, the sounds of the reception muffled as the door closed behind us. "Your reputation precedes you," Georgia said, leaning against the railing. "The most rigorous judge in the Western Circuit." "I prefer fair to rigorous," I replied, finally sipping the champagne. "Is that why you're keeping your distance? Fairness?" I nearly choked on my drink. "Ms. Lee." "Georgia," she corrected. "Georgia. I'm 20 years your senior and potentially judging your entries. There are about a dozen ethical boundaries being crossed just by this conversation." She smiled. "I counted 13, actually." Her fingertips brushed against my hand on the railing. "But who's counting?" The night air suddenly felt too thin. Her face was close to mine, eyes reflecting the string lights from the garden below. For a breathless moment, I thought she might kiss me. Worse, I thought I might let her. The balcony door opened, flooding us with light and chatter. Martha stood there, eyebrows raised. "Claudia, they're asking for the judges inside." Georgia stepped back smoothly, professional distance restored in an instant. "Thank you for the insight on feather density assessment, Judge Cooper. Extremely educational." She slipped past Martha with a polite nod, leaving me with a knowing look from my friend. "That," Martha said after Georgia was out of earshot, "is trouble on legs. Pretty legs, but trouble all the same." "It was a professional conversation," I insisted. "Your lipstick smudged," Martha replied dryly. "It wasn't, but the fact that I immediately checked my reflection in the glass door told us both everything we needed to know." "Claudia," she said more gently, "be careful. That girl is half your age and competing in your category. Some lines aren't worth crossing, no matter how pretty the view is on the other side." I knew she was right. I'd built my reputation on integrity and unbiased judgment. One impulsive attraction wasn't worth trading that for. And yet, as I rejoined the reception, my eyes sought her out automatically. When they finally found her across the room, she was already watching me, that same knowing look in her eyes, as if she could see right through every barrier I'd carefully constructed over the years. I told myself it was professional curiosity that led me to Georgia Lee's breeding facility 1 week after the competition. Her Birmingham rollers had taken second place, not because I went easy on her, but because they genuinely deserved it. The genetic advancements she'd achieved in just 3 breeding cycles were remarkable, and if I was being honest with myself, I wanted to see her methodology up close. That's what I kept repeating as I drove 30 miles outside Bakersfield to the rural property where she worked her magic. Professional interest, research, career development. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the modern facility nestled among traditional barns. Georgia was waiting outside, dressed in work clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, showing surprisingly strong forearms. A far cry from the elegant woman at the reception, but somehow even more appealing. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said, walking toward my car. "I almost didn't," I admitted, stepping out into the autumn air. She led me through the main breeding building, explaining her unconventional approach. "Most breeders focus on visible traits and performance, but I'm working backward from genetic markers." As she spoke about recessive traits and marker isolation, I found myself captivated not just by her methods, but by her mind. This wasn't some hobbyist who'd inherited family birds. Georgia Lee was a genuine innovator, with educational background and research data to support her techniques. "This performance data is extraordinary," I said, reviewing her notebooks. "How many generations did it take to stabilize the mid-air roll timing?" 3. Her eyes lit up with passion. "But the third generation was a genetic bottleneck risk, so I introduced this bloodline." She leaned over to point at her notebook, her shoulder brushing mine. I caught a whiff of that same ginger scent from the subway, mixed with something uniquely her. The proximity made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity. We were deep in discussion about genetic diversity when the first rumble of thunder sounded outside. By the time we finished touring the secondary breeding houses, fat raindrops were pelting the metal roof. "This doesn't look like it's letting up," Georgia said, peering out the window at the darkening sky. "The road back to the highway floods easily. You might want to wait it out." As if punctuating her warning, lightning flashed, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. "Well, that settles it," she sighed in the sudden darkness. "You're stuck with me until morning. The road will be underwater by now." I should have been annoyed or inconvenienced, but the flutter in my stomach suggested something else entirely. Georgia moved efficiently in the dark, finding candles and an old kerosene lamp that cast a warm glow across the small office attached to the breeding facility. She produced a bottle of wine from a cabinet. "Emergency provisions," she explained with a grin. With the storm raging outside and nothing but candlelight within, time seemed to fold in on itself. One glass of wine became two as we moved from discussing pigeons to sharing life stories. I told her about my divorce after 20 years of marriage, about realizing I'd lived most of my life on someone else's terms. "And now?" she asked, refilling my glass. "Whose terms are you living on now?" "My own," I said firmly. "Or at least I'm trying to." "That's why I noticed you," she said suddenly, her voice softer. "On the subway that day. There was something about the way you stood, like you were completely self-contained. I couldn't look away." "I thought it was the other way around," I admitted. "I felt you watching me." I was. Georgia set down her glass and moved closer on the small sofa where we'd settled. "I've been watching you since I entered my first competition 3 years ago. Judge Cooper, the legend. The woman who could spot a flight feather irregularity from across the exhibition hall. And now here you are, trapped with the legend during a thunderstorm," I said, trying to lighten the suddenly charged atmosphere. "Not trapped," she said quietly. "Exactly where I want to be." The pigeons cooed softly in their enclosure, a gentle counterpoint to the rain hammering on the roof. I was acutely aware of every inch between us on the sofa, a distance that seemed to be shrinking though neither of us had moved. "Georgia," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "This isn't professional?" She finished for me. "No, it isn't, but I'm not interested in being professional with you, Claudia. I've been drawn to you since the first time I saw you judge a competition in San Diego. And when our eyes met in that subway station, I knew you felt it too." Before I could formulate a response, she leaned forward and kissed me. Her lips were soft but insistent, tasting of wine and certainty. For one breathless moment, I allowed myself to kiss her back, my hand rising to touch her wild red hair. When we finally broke apart, the sound of the storm seemed amplified in the small space between us. Everything I'd built, my reputation, my professional standing, felt suddenly precarious, balanced against the unexpected weight of desire I'd been carrying since that moment on the subway platform. "Say something," Georgia whispered, her fingers still intertwined with mine. What could I possibly say that would make any sense of what was happening? The words that finally came surprised even me. "I'm too old for you." But Georgia just smiled, the candlelight catching in her eyes. "Or maybe," she said, leaning in again, "I'm exactly old enough for you." The pigeons rustled in their nests as if in agreement, and I found myself unable to remember a single reason why her logic might be flawed. Morning after the storm brought clarity I wasn't prepared for. I pulled away from Georgia both physically and emotionally, gathering my things while she made coffee in the small kitchenette. "You're running," she observed, handing me a steaming mug that I accepted without meeting her eyes. "I'm being realistic," I countered, checking my phone for missed calls. "Last night was wonderful, but it was also a mistake. Because I'm too young." Georgia leaned against the counter, studying me with those penetrating green eyes. "Or because you're too scared?" "Because you're 27 and I'm 45, I said flatly. "Do the math, Georgia. When you were starting kindergarten, I was already judging national competitions. When you had your first kiss, I was getting divorced. And that matters why, exactly." I set down the coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Because I've had more birthdays than relationships in my life. Because everything is still beginning for you, and I'm maintenance phase. Oil changes and tire rotations trying to keep the engine running." Georgia laughed, which only irritated me more. "That's the most ridiculous automotive metaphor for aging I've ever heard." "It doesn't make it less true." She crossed the room and took my hands, her touch sending unwelcome warmth through my veins. "Claudia, age is just data. It's not a personality trait or a barrier unless you make it one." I pulled my hands away. "Easy for you to say from the younger side of the equation." The drive back to Bakersfield was silent and tense, with Georgia respecting my request not to discuss what had happened. When I dropped her at her apartment, she simply said, "This conversation isn't over," before closing the car door with decisive finality. I threw myself into work for the next 2 weeks, accepting every judging invitation that came my way. But Georgia was persistent, sending text messages with interesting articles on pigeon genetics that gradually evolved into invitations for coffee, dinner, drinks. Finally, I agreed to meet her at a small cafe downtown, telling myself it was just to clarify boundaries. She arrived with a younger man and woman who she introduced as Benjamin and Talia. "My closest friends," she explained, as we settled at an outdoor table. "I wanted you to meet them." I felt ambushed and slightly betrayed. "I thought we were meeting to talk." "We are," Georgia said calmly. "But I thought it might help if you saw that not everyone sees age gaps as catastrophic." Benjamin, a stylish graphic designer with an easy smile, reached for his partner's hand across the table. "My husband is 20 years older than me. We've been together 7 years. I shifted uncomfortably. "That's different." "How?" Talia challenged, stirring her iced tea. "Because they're men? Because you've convinced yourself there's some magic cutoff date for finding connection?" "Because I've built a life that works," I insisted. "Because I've finally found stability after years of living for someone else." Georgia's eyes softened. "And you think caring for me would mean losing that?" The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Benjamin and Talia sharing their own perspectives on relationships that defied conventional expectations. Despite my resistance, I found myself enjoying their company, particularly when Benjamin described his husband's initial reluctance that mirrored my own concerns. As we were preparing to leave, my phone rang. The caller ID made my stomach drop. My ex-husband, Richard. "I have to take this," I said, stepping away from the table. Richard's voice was immediately accusatory. "Is it true? You're dating some 20-something pigeon breeder?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "How did you—" "Small world, Claudia. Georgia Lee's uncle plays golf with my business partner. Apparently she's been quite vocal about pursuing you." "It's not what you think," I started, but he cut me off. "Do you have any idea how this looks? The past president of the National Pigeon Association shacking up with a competitor young enough to be her daughter? We are not shacking up," I hissed, turning away from the cafe table where Georgia watched with concern. "And my personal life is none of your business. It is when it affects my reputation by association." When I returned to the table, my hands were shaking with rage. I briefly explained the situation while gathering my purse. "I should go," I said stiffly. "Thank you for the coffee." Georgia followed me outside, catching my arm as rain began to fall lightly around us. "Don't let him get to you. He doesn't control your life anymore. You don't understand. In my world—" "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You're letting the opinions of others dictate your happiness." Again. The rain intensified, plastering her red hair to her face as she stepped closer. "Is that really how you want to live? After everything you've accomplished?" Something in her words broke through my carefully constructed defenses. Standing there in the rain, with water streaming down both our faces, I saw the choice before me with sudden clarity: safety or possibility. Georgia brushed wet strands of hair from my face with gentle fingers. "What are you really afraid of, Claudia?" And there, with pedestrians hurrying past with umbrellas and car horns honking in the distance, I let her kiss me. Let myself kiss her back, rain-soaked and terrified, and somehow more alive than I'd felt in years. "I'm afraid of wanting this too much," I whispered against her lips, the truth finally breaking free. "Of starting something I'm too old to survive losing." She smiled, rain dripping from her eyelashes. "Then we'll just have to make sure you don't lose it." The migraines started 3 weeks into our relationship. The first attack hit during a small dinner party at Georgia's apartment, a blinding pain behind my right eye that sent me stumbling to the bathroom. I vomited twice before Georgia found me, pale and sweating, slumped against her bathtub. "This isn't normal," she insisted after the third episode left me bedridden for an entire weekend. I waved her off. "Just stress. The regional championships are coming up." But when a CAT scan and full neurological workup revealed nothing abnormal, I began to worry. The pain was getting worse, accompanied by strange flashes of imagery I couldn't place. Cobblestone streets, a small apartment with windows overlooking unfamiliar architecture, a woman's hands arranging flowers whose scent I could somehow recall. Georgia researched obsessively, bringing me articles on everything from food triggers to environmental factors. Nothing helped. By the 6th week, I was missing competition dates and struggling to function between attacks. "I found someone," Georgia announced one evening, perching on the edge of my bed where I lay with an ice pack over my eyes. "A doctor with a different approach." "If you say acupuncture, I'll scream," I muttered. "We tried that." "Hypnotherapy." I removed the ice pack to stare at her. "You can't be serious." Dr. Ward has had remarkable success with treatment-resistant migraines, particularly ones with— She hesitated. Unusual sensory components. I hadn't told Georgia about the strange sensory flashes, the inexplicable memories. "What makes you think mine have unusual components?" Her expression told me I talked in my sleep more than I realized. "Doctor." Ward's office was unexpectedly clinical, no crystal balls or velvet curtains, just modern furniture and framed credentials from respected medical institutions. The doctor herself, a composed woman in her 60s, spoke with the precise diction of someone who'd spent decades having to prove her legitimacy. "The mind often uses pain to communicate what we're not ready to consciously process," she explained, guiding me to a comfortable recliner. "Hypnosis simply opens a door to that communication." Georgia squeezed my hand before moving to a chair in the corner of the room. "I'll be right here." Dr. Ward's voice was melodic as she led me through progressive relaxation techniques. I felt myself drifting, still aware of the room but increasingly detached from it. When she asked me to visualize a door that contained the source of my pain, I saw it immediately, a weathered blue door with brass fittings, sunlight playing across its surface. "Can you open the door, Claudia?" Dr. Ward's voice seemed to come from far away. When I pushed the door open in my mind, the migraine that had been building all morning suddenly vanished. Instead of relief, however, I felt a rush of emotions not my own: excitement, fear, passionate longing. "Where are you?" Dr. Ward asked. "Paris," I heard myself answer. 1924. "My name is Elise." What followed was the strangest experience of my life. I spoke of living in a small apartment in Montmartre, of painting in a sun-drenched studio, of falling madly in love with a flower seller named Marie, who had wild red hair and laughing eyes. I described our secret affair, the letters we exchanged, the way society forced us to hide our love. As Elise, I spoke fluent French, described paintings I'd created, recounted memories of a life I'd never lived. "She's going to America," I heard myself say, voice breaking with emotion. "Her family discovered us. They're sending her away on the morning ship. I'll never see her again." When Dr. Ward gently brought me back to consciousness, Georgia was pale, her eyes wide with shock. I felt disoriented, memories of two lives overlapping in my mind. That was. I struggled for words. I don't know what that was. My imagination running wild, I suppose. Dr. Ward handed me a glass of water. "Was any of that familiar to you? Any of those details something you might have read or seen in a film?" I shook my head, then froze as Georgia pulled down the collar of her shirt, revealing a small crescent-shaped birthmark on her collarbone. "You described this," she whispered. "Exactly this. You said Marie had a mark like a thin moon where her neck met her shoulder. You said you used to trace it with your finger when she slept." That night, after hours of attempting to rationalize what had happened, we lay together in my bed, Georgia's head resting on my chest. "Do you think it's possible?" she asked softly. "That souls find each other again?" "I don't know what to think," I admitted. "I've never believed in past lives or soulmates or any of that. But today..." She raised herself on one elbow to look at me, that wild red hair falling around her face just as I'd described seeing it in another lifetime. Maybe that's why I couldn't look away on that subway platform. Maybe some part of me remembered you. "Even if it's true," I said, "they didn't get their happy ending. Marie left on that ship." George's fingers traced patterns on my skin in the darkness. "Then maybe we're meant to finish what they started." She kissed me then, and something shifted between us, a deepening, as if the connection we'd been building had suddenly found its roots. What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Each touch seemed to carry echoes of other times, other places. When she whispered my name, it felt like she had been saying it across centuries. Later, lying in the quiet aftermath, Georgia sleeping peacefully beside me, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us together. The subway platform, the storm at her breeding facility, the hypnosis session that had opened a door I never knew existed. I touched the crescent birthmark on her shoulder, feeling the truth of what we'd discovered today. Whatever was happening between us had started long before either of us was born, and for the first time since my divorce, the future didn't look like a slow decline into comfortable solitude. It looked like possibility. I returned to Dr. Ward's office alone the following week. Georgia wanted to come, but I needed space to process whatever might emerge without watching her reactions. "Are you ready to open that door again?" Dr. Ward asked after settling me into the recliner. This time, the door in my mind was different. Heavy wood with iron bands, medieval in appearance. Beyond it, I found myself in 16th century Vienna, living as a widowed seamstress named Johanna. Again, there was a woman with red hair, this time a traveling musician named Elizabeth. Over 3 more sessions, I uncovered fragments of 4 different lifetimes. In each one, Georgia and I, or rather, our souls, found each other, loved each other, and were separated by circumstance, family intervention, or death. The patterns were hauntingly consistent: recognition, brief happiness, then loss. I kept detailed notes after each session but shared only selective details with Georgia. The weight of these accumulated tragedies felt too heavy to place on our new relationship. How could we possibly move forward freely with the knowledge that we'd never managed to stay together across multiple lifetimes? Late one night, Georgia found me at my kitchen table, surrounded by my notes. "You're not telling me everything," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I can feel it." I pushed a strand of hair behind my ear, suddenly exhausted. "Because some things are better left unknown. That's not your decision to make for both of us." She was right, of course. I'd been protecting her, or perhaps myself, from the full weight of what I'd discovered. That night, I shared all of it, the varying circumstances, the consistent patterns, the unresolved endings. We never make it, I concluded, voice catching. In every life, something tears us apart before we have a chance to grow old together. Georgia absorbed this with remarkable calm. That was then. We're here now, with different choices. The next morning, Georgia called excitedly from her apartment. I'm experiencing it too. The déjà vu, it's getting stronger. She described dreaming of a garden I'd seen in my hypnosis session, details matching perfectly despite my never having described it to her. Then came the incident at the antique store. We were browsing a small shop when Georgia stopped abruptly before a display case containing an ornate silver hand mirror. It has roses engraved on the back, she said, though the mirror lay face up. And the handle is slightly bent from being dropped. The shopkeeper, intrigued, removed the mirror from the case. Georgia was right on both counts. How did you know? I asked when we were alone. I just remembered it. It was mine, hers, Marie's. A gift from you. From Elise. These moments continued. Georgia spontaneously recognizing objects, places, even phrases from the lives I'd glimpsed under hypnosis. The connections between us deepened, as if our present relationship was being reinforced by the echoes of past ones. Then my daughter Phoebe called, announcing an impromptu visit to Bakersfield. At 45, I had a 23-year-old daughter who knew nothing about Georgia or my unexpected late-life sexual awakening. I should stay away while she's here, Georgia offered. Give you space to talk to her. No, I said firmly. I'm done hiding who I am. She should meet you. Phoebe arrived with the whirlwind energy she'd possessed since childhood, filling my apartment with chatter about her new job in marketing. When Georgia joined us for dinner that evening, I made the introduction I'd been rehearsing all day. Phoebe, this is Georgia Lee. She's a pioneering pigeon breeder and... I took a steadying breath. She's also my partner. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Phoebe's fork paused midway to her mouth. Your partner, she repeated. As in? As in, we're together, I confirmed, reaching for Georgia's hand across the table. Phoebe set down her fork with deliberate precision. Mom, you're not gay. You were married to Dad for 20 years. And now I'm with Georgia, I said simply. Life is more complicated than the labels we choose. Is this some kind of midlife crisis? Phoebe demanded, voice rising. First the divorce, now this? It's not a crisis, Georgia interjected gently. It's just who your mother is. Phoebe's eyes flashed. Stay out of this. You're practically my age. What could you possibly know about my mother? The evening deteriorated from there. By dessert, Phoebe had declared she needed a hotel room rather than staying in my guest room as planned. Her parting shot cut deeper than I'd expected. Does it even matter to you what this will do to the family? To me? To your grandchildren someday? After she left, I sat motionless at the dining table, dishes still scattered across its surface. Georgia cleared them quietly, giving me space to process. She'll come around, Georgia finally said, placing her hands on my shoulders. But I wasn't so sure. In every past life we'd uncovered, family rejection had played a role in our separation. Now, watching history potentially repeat itself, I couldn't help wondering if we were caught in some cosmic loop, doomed to find and lose each other again and again. Later that night, Georgia held me as I finally let the tears come. What if we're fighting against something bigger than ourselves? I whispered into the darkness. What if we're not meant to make it in this lifetime either? Her arms tightened around me. Then we'll find each other in the next one, and the next, until we get it right. Phoebe's reaction affected me more deeply than I wanted to admit. After 3 days of unanswered calls, she finally texted, I need time to process this, please respect that. But it wasn't just her reaction that haunted me. It was watching the same pattern unfold that had separated us in previous lifetimes. The disapproval, the choice between love and family. Like reading a book where you already know the tragic ending. Georgia noticed my withdrawal. You're pulling away, she said one evening as I made excuses about work commitments. I'm just busy, I lied, focusing on the competition schedules spread across my dining table. Claudia. Her voice was gentle but firm. Talk to me. When I finally looked up, the hurt in her eyes broke something loose inside me. What if Phoebe never accepts this? What if I have to choose? And you think pulling away from me preemptively solves that problem? She was right, but the fear had taken root. That weekend, after a strained dinner where I'd been distant and preoccupied, I made the decision that had been forming since Phoebe's visit. I think we need to take a break, I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. Georgia stared at me, her face going pale. Because of Phoebe? Because I've lived more years without true love than with it, I said, echoing words I'd said earlier in our relationship. I can continue that way. That's not a reason, Georgia argued, her voice rising. That's surrender. It's reality. My daughter won't speak to me. My colleagues are whispering. My ex-husband is threatening to have me removed from the Judges Association Board. And those things matter more than this? She gestured between us. Then what we found? I couldn't answer, which was answer enough. Georgia left my apartment that night with tears streaming down her face, and I convinced myself I'd done the right thing. That breaking the cycle now would hurt less than watching it play out to its inevitable conclusion. The Northwestern Regional Championship arrived 2 weeks later. I threw myself into judging, grateful for the distraction. Georgia's birds were entered, but I'd arranged for another judge to evaluate her categories, citing conflict of interest. Martha found me during a break between judging sessions. You look like hell. Thank you for that assessment, I replied dryly. She's here, you know. Her Birmingham roller just took first place in juvenile display. My heart contracted painfully. Good for her. Good for her? Martha echoed incredulously. That's all you have to say? Claudia, I've known you for decades, and I've never seen you as alive as you were with her. I turned away, unable to maintain my composure. It doesn't matter. Because you decided it doesn't? Or because you're too scared to fight for something that matters? I escaped to the empty judge's lounge, needing space from Martha's uncomfortable truths. But solitude only made the ache worse. I found myself scrolling through photos on my phone. Georgia with her prize birds, Georgia laughing in the rain, Georgia asleep on my couch with a research journal open on her chest. A text from an unknown number interrupted my masochistic reminiscing. It contained only a picture of an antique wooden desk with ornate brass handles. Georgia found it in the estate sales section of the Sunday paper. The desk was being sold from a storage unit whose owner had died without heirs. Something about it had called to her, she explained when I called her, my curiosity overriding my resolution to maintain distance. It's from the 1920s, she said. I think it belonged to Elise. That's impossible, I replied, though my skin prickled with recognition. Come see for yourself. I shouldn't have gone. Every rational part of my brain knew that. But 2 hours later, I was standing in Georgia's apartment, staring at an Art Deco desk that featured prominently in my hypnotic memories of 1920s Paris. Open the secret drawer, Georgia said quietly. What secret drawer? She smiled sadly. You know which one. And somehow, I did. My fingers found the hidden catch behind the leftmost drawer handle, a small depression that, when pressed, released a narrow compartment beneath the main drawer. The bundle of letters inside was tied with faded blue ribbon. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. They were written in French, correspondence between Elise and Marie spanning months of separation after Marie had been sent to America. I found these inside when I was cleaning it, Georgia said softly. They never saw each other again, Claudia. Marie died of influenza in 1927. Elise never knew. She kept writing letters for years, never understanding why Marie stopped responding. I felt dizzy, the weight of this tangible evidence of our past connection overwhelming me. This doesn't change anything, I insisted weakly. It changes everything, Georgia countered. We have their letters. We know how their story ended, how all our stories have ended before. We can choose differently. The final day of the competition arrived with Georgia's Birmingham roller advancing to the championship round. Protocol dictated that as head judge, I present the awards regardless of who evaluated the individual categories. When her bird was announced as the winner, Georgia approached the podium with professional composure. Our hands brushed as I handed her the ribbon. The contact only lasted seconds, but it was enough to shatter my carefully maintained facade. "Congratulations, Ms. Lee," I said formally, though my voice betrayed me by trembling. "Thank you, Judge Cooper," she replied, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made the crowded exhibition hall fade away. When she leaned forward to accept the customary congratulatory kiss on the cheek, she whispered, "We're not them, Claudia. We don't have to repeat their mistakes." Her lips brushed my cheek, then moved to my lips in a brief but unmistakable kiss. The audience's surprised murmurs faded beneath the roaring in my ears, as memories, both this lifetime's and others, cascaded through me. That kiss on the awards platform changed everything and nothing. Publicly, I was both criticized and celebrated, the respected judge who'd come out in the most dramatic fashion. Privately, I was still tangled in my own fears about what choosing Georgia would mean for my other relationships. 2 days after the competition ended, I sat alone in my apartment staring at a framed photo of Phoebe and me from her college graduation. The distance in her eyes had been there long before Georgia entered my life, a gradual withdrawal that began with my divorce and deepened as I reclaimed independence. My phone rang. It was Richard, undoubtedly calling to berate me about the award ceremony. I answered with resignation. "You've gone completely off the rails," he began without preamble. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Phoebe? To me? To our family name?" Something snapped inside me. "Our family name? We've been divorced for 6 years, Richard. And when exactly did you start caring about Phoebe's feelings? Was it before or after you missed her graduation for a golf tournament?" "That's different, and you know it," he sputtered. "No, it's not. I've spent my entire life being judged, birds, people, myself. I've contorted myself to fit into everyone else's expectations. I'm done." I hung up and immediately called Phoebe. When she answered, I didn't give her a chance to retreat. "I've judged pigeons my whole life on their quality, not their age," I said, echoing a conversation from months earlier. "I've evaluated their worth based on what they are, not what others expect them to be. I've never applied that same standard to myself, until now." There was a long silence before Phoebe spoke. "Mom, Let me finish. I'm still your mother. I still love you more than anything in this world. But Georgia is part of my life now, and I need you to at least try to understand that." "Is she really worth risking our relationship?" Phoebe asked quietly. "I'm not risking our relationship. I'm asking you not to make me choose between my happiness and your comfort." Another long pause. "I need time. Take all the time you need," I said. "But know that when you're ready, we'll both be here." After hanging up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to deny who I was, who I wanted. I called Georgia next and asked her to meet me at our favorite cafe. It was time to fight for what mattered, whatever the consequences. She arrived looking guarded, the hurt of our separation still evident in her eyes. Before she could speak, I handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "An invitation to present at the European Breeding Symposium in Brussels. They want your research on genetic diversity preservation." Her eyes widened. "This is incredible. It's career-changing." "It's also in 2 months," I said carefully. "For a 6-month residency." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You think I should go?" "I think it's an amazing opportunity that you've earned through brilliant work, and I took a deep breath. "I think we need to decide what matters most to both of us." "You matter most," she said immediately. "This relationship matters. Even if it means giving up opportunities, even if it means dealing with my complicated family, even if it means weathering the scrutiny of colleagues who think you're just my midlife crisis." Georgia reached across the table for my hands. "Claudia, we've found each other across centuries. Do you really think distance or disapproval is going to stop us now?" 2 weeks later, as Georgia was weighing the symposium offer, disaster struck. A spring storm with unprecedented winds tore through the county, hitting her breeding facility hardest. I got the call at midnight: buildings damaged, power out, birds at risk. I arrived to chaos. Georgia was directing volunteers in the rain, moving birds to the one undamaged structure. The main breeding building's roof had partially collapsed, exposing valuable equipment to the elements. "The incubators are still in there," Georgia shouted over the wind when she saw me. "If we don't get them, we'll lose this entire generation of genetic stock." Without hesitation, I followed her into the damaged building. We worked side by side in the dark, rain pouring through the roof, securing incubators and moving them to safety. "The Birmingham bloodline," Georgia cried suddenly, pointing to a section where water was rapidly pooling beneath specialized incubation units. 3 years of work. A cracking sound overhead made me look up to see roofing material shifting dangerously. "Georgia, move!" I shoved her clear as a section of beam came down, missing us both by inches. We stared at each other in the near darkness, soaked and mud-splattered, the reality of what could have happened hanging between us like the dangling beam. "I'm not going to Brussels," she said suddenly, rain streaming down her face. "What? Georgia? You have to." "No." She moved closer, cupping my face in her muddy hands. "I've made my choice. I choose you. Here, now. This lifetime." The storm still raged around us, but something profound had settled within me. As we stood in the ruins of her breeding facility, I finally understood that what we were building together was stronger than any force, natural or social, that might try to tear it down. That night, amid the chaos of salvage operations, Georgia and I reconnected in ways that transcended physical passion. There was an urgency born from nearly losing each other, both to the literal danger of the collapsed building and to the figurative dangers of fear and separation. Later, as volunteers continued working outside, we lay together in the small office, physically exhausted but emotionally renewed. "I think I understand now," I whispered against her hair. "Why we keep finding each other." "Why?" Georgia asked sleepily. "Because some connections are worth fighting for, again and again, until we get it right." Asking Georgia to move in with me was both the easiest and hardest decision I'd made. Easiest because after nearly losing her twice, once to my own fears and once to that collapsed beam, I couldn't imagine another day of separate lives. Hardest because it meant publicly declaring ourselves in a town where whispers traveled faster than pigeons in flight. "You're sure?" Georgia asked, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, surrounded by packing boxes. "Your colleagues, you're standing in the community." "I've spent enough lifetimes hiding," I replied, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. "Let them talk." And talk they did. The local Pigeon Breeding Association had a field day with the news. Some members supported us, others resigned in protest. My position on the national judging panel came under scrutiny, though ultimately my reputation for fair assessment preserved my standing. Each morning, I awoke beside Georgia's wild red hair spread across my pillows. I felt more certain we were breaking the cycle that had separated us in past lives. We were choosing differently, choosing each other openly, despite the consequences. The breeding facility was rebuilt by summer, with improvements Georgia had dreamed of but never implemented. My organizational skills complemented her visionary approach, and soon, we were collaborating professionally as well as personally. "You know," I said one evening as we reviewed genetic charts, "for someone who judges birds on their quality rather than their age, I was remarkably blind about applying that standard to relationships." Georgia laughed, that rich sound that still made my heart skip. "Better late than never, Judge Cooper." The most surprising reconciliation came 6 months after Georgia moved in. My doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon, revealing Phoebe standing uncertainly on my porch. "I brought wine," she said, holding up a bottle. "And an open mind." Georgia gave us space, heading to the breeding facility while Phoebe and I talked for hours. She asked questions, real questions about my life, my happiness, how I'd discovered this part of myself so late. "You've judged pigeons on their quality, not their age," she finally said, echoing my earlier words. "I should judge your relationship the same way." "And what's your verdict?" I asked nervously. That I've never seen you this happy, she admitted. Not even before the divorce. It's like you finally stopped performing and started living. When Georgia returned, Phoebe made a genuine effort to engage with her, asking about her research and breeding techniques. By evening's end, they had discovered a shared passion for vintage jazz records of all things. As Phoebe was leaving, she hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she whispered. "I just needed to understand this wasn't about rejecting our family but about finding yourself." Better late than never. I echoed my earlier words to Georgia, watching my daughter walk to her car with lighter steps than when she'd arrived. 1 year after Georgia and I met on that subway platform, we decided to recreate our first encounter. We rode the same train, stood on the same platform, even wore similar outfits to that rainy Tuesday that had changed everything. "You were standing right there," Georgia said, pointing across the tracks, looking impossibly elegant and completely closed off. "And you were staring at me like you could see right through all my carefully constructed walls," I replied, taking her hand. "I could," she said simply. "I'd been looking for you for lifetimes." The train arrived, doors opening with the same mechanical hiss that had preceded our first conversation. As passengers flowed around us, Georgia pulled me close and kissed me right there on the platform, a public declaration that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. As we broke apart, I noticed a young woman across the platform watching us with an expression I recognized immediately. The same startled recognition I'd felt seeing Georgia for the first time. The woman stood beside another woman at least 15 years her senior, their hands not quite touching, but bodies angled toward each other, as if by magnetic attraction. When their eyes met, I saw the same electric awareness pass between them that Georgia and I had experienced. "Look," I murmured, nodding toward them. "Do you see it?" Georgia followed my gaze and smiled. "Souls finding each other again. Think they'll get it right this time?" I asked, leaning against her as we boarded our train. "Maybe," Georgia said, watching the women disappear as the train pulled away. "Or maybe they'll need a few more lifetimes of practice. Either way, they'll keep trying until they do." I thought about the letters in the secret drawer, the memories uncovered during hypnosis, the multiple lifetimes of finding and losing each other. The patterns had seemed inescapable until we'd made different choices, choosing courage over fear, authenticity over acceptance. "What are you thinking about?" Georgia asked as the city scrolled by outside our window. "About how some connections are stronger than time," I said, interlacing our fingers, "and how sometimes it takes centuries to learn that love is always worth the risk.